Okay, so this presentation, I'm going to be discussing the topic of Ellen White because this is something that's going to come up any time anybody wants to look into Adventist theology. But before addressing Ellen White directly, there's some certain questions that people need to think about when they think about the possibility of modern prophets. And the first issue they should be asking themselves is, does the Bible teach that the gifts of the Spirit, which include prophecy and which is something that was manifested at the time of the apostles, does the Bible teach that these are going to be stopped after the time of the apostles? So there's such a belief or doctrine called cessationism, which argues that after the apostles died, there was no more prophecy, there was no more you shouldn't be able to find any more prophets after that. So the idea is that a prophet is automatically a modern prophet is automatically a false prophet because there are no prophets after the time after the close of the biblical canon. Okay. Unfortunately, this is not something that can be demonstrated with scripture. I mean, I know people think they can, but what I recommend for those that haven't made up their mind already and don't have a philosophical or theological bias, if you're open to the question, read the New Testament from the beginning to end and see for yourself if it actually teaches that there's not going to be any more prophets after all the apostles have died. Okay, so that's one question you need to ask yourself. The other question is whether there's different degrees of inspiration between prophets. So this is not saying that some prophets are, they've made a bigger impact than others. So maybe Isaiah has written a fairly large book, and somebody like Nahum or Amos have just a little bit here and there in scripture that they have to say. That's not the question. The question is the actual communication coming through them from God. Is there degrees where you could say, okay, this prophet, their accuracy of what God is saying is higher than this other prophet? And again, that's something that you cannot see in scripture. Basically, the question you ask is either, is this a true prophet or a false prophet? And if they are a true prophet, what they're saying is just as authoritative as what any other true prophet is saying throughout the Bible. So that's another thing that somebody should resolve for themselves, independent of anything to do with Adventism. Another thing is the question of inerrancy. Again, a lot of people that come from like the more conservative side of Christianity believe in inerrancy, and they expect any prophet to be inerrant. But what I've argued is that that's not a good idea, not a good position to take. And when it comes to Adventists, at least, we don't believe in inerrancy, so we don't apply that to any modern prophet either, because we don't believe it applies to the people in the Bible. Another thing is to think through the implications of what it would be like to have a modern prophet. So let's say there is such a thing as a modern prophet, and let's say a prophet shows up in your own denomination, assuming you're coming from another point of view. How would you relate to that prophet? Would you take their interpretation over the Bible's interpretation? Now, I know you're going to say, well, if they're a true prophet, they're not going to contradict the Bible, but it could be that you're misunderstanding the Bible. So how would you relate to that prophet, and in what sphere will they have authority when it comes to their prophetic ministry? So that those are questions somebody should ask themselves regarding the idea of modern prophets before they evaluate anybody's actual prophets. So these are prerequisite topics that somebody should reason through and then come and talk to an Adventist about Ellen White. Another question is, how would this prophet, how would you relate to them in their daily life? So let's say in your denomination, a prophet comes in 1960, and then for the next 40 years, they live among you and they have their prophetic ministry. What does that mean for how you interact with them on a daily basis? Like if you show up at the grocery store and they're over there shopping and they come and say hi and they tell you something, is that a prophetic message? Or is everything that they say coming directly from God, or can they be a normal person living a normal life, and still be an actual prophet and an actual messenger for God in any other setting, or how would that work? Like, basically, I would like to see people reason through these things before even bringing up the issue of Ellen White, to see how all those things will work, because they had to work in Bible times. I mean, Isaiah lived with other Jewish people for several decades, and they had to engage with them and interact with them in some way. And all the other prophets in the Bible, Moses, everybody else, they actually saw these people day in and day out. So this is something that somebody should think about ahead of time. Okay, so with that being said, let's take a little bit of time and think about scripture in contrast with any other kind of prophet whose writings have not made it into the canon of scripture. Okay, so there's something unique about the biblical revelation that cannot be applied to any other individual, even if they are genuine prophets, historically or within recent history. Okay, so first of all, the Bible starts off with Moses. So Moses becomes kind of like a cornerstone for the rest of the prophetic revelation after that. And Moses is authenticated or endorsed, first of all, by a certain prophetic expectation that precedes him that we don't have in writing. So, for example, God tells Abraham that the people of Israel are going to go into a foreign country and they're going to be oppressed, and then they're going to come back to Canaan after 400 years and all this stuff. Now we could say, okay, Moses is the one that wrote that down. But if we went back in time to the time of Moses, this is the expectation that the people had in Israel, because they grew up in this community where they were in slavery, but they were expecting somebody to come and to deliver them. So Moses comes within a certain prophetic expectation. And then their ministry is endorsed by all kinds of miracles, like the plagues on Egypt, the parting of the Red Sea, all the different miracles that happened throughout the 40 years in the wilderness. His ministry is endorsed by his holy life. I mean, for 40 years, the man is fully dedicated to his mission. He has a massive impact on the children of Israel. All these different things become things that endorse the ministry of Moses and give him the right to establish the starting components of the biblical canon, right? So he writes the first 5 books, or at least compiles other people's writings, and puts together the beginning parts of scripture. And Moses creates this trajectory within which all subsequent prophets have to kind of build on. So people that come after Moses, they come and continue on in this trajectory. So they reinforce the religion of Moses, so to speak, everything that Moses established and started. Their own ministry, so maybe people like Samuel or people like Joshua or even later prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah, they continue in the same trajectory that was started by Moses and followed by all the subsequent prophets. Their own ministry is endorsed by divine miracles. Their own faithful life attests to their ministry, and sometimes they're even killed, and their martyrdom becomes an additional endorsement of the fact that they were genuine prophets. All the way we do this, all the way till we come to the New Testament era. Now, we got to clarify that there's many different prophets mentioned in scripture, but only some of them become authors of the biblical writings. And even within those who do become authors of the biblical writings, they have other writings, but for whatever reason, those writings did not make it into the canon. So, for example, the Apostle Paul tells us that he wrote a letter to other places, and we don't have those writings. I think the Corinthians letters, there should be 3, and we only have 2 of them. And there's other examples as well. So there's lots of different prophets, but only some make it into the canon. And there's lots of different writings, but only some of those writings make it into the canon. Okay, so then we come to the New Testament, and Jesus comes on the scene, and he is pointed forward to by all these different people before him. So there's a prophetic expectation where people are waiting for the Messiah, and he steps into this prophetic expectation, even though it's somewhat different than what people anticipated would happen, but he still, like the entire a big section of the Gospels in the New Testament are focused on showing how Jesus is a fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecies. And then Jesus, his own ministry is endorsed by his miracles, by his holy life, by his death and resurrection. And all these different things become an endorsement of Jesus's ministry. And then Jesus endorses backwards. He endorses the Old Testament because throughout his ministry, he appeals to the Old Testament as a justification for everything he does. So he honors the Old Testament and he honors the prophets that came before him, but he also endorses the apostles after him and gives them authority. Those like the apostles that pretty much lived after Jesus died and was taken to heaven and so on. And it is these apostles that have spent the 3.5 years with Jesus, have learned from him directly, have understood his way of thinking. They are the ones that oversee the rest of the New Testament. So everything that's written within the New Testament is done under the oversight of the apostolic community. So they endorse the writing of the New Testament. And then after this, the canon is closed. And besides this, there's one more endorsement which comes from apocalyptic prophecy, assuming you're working with a historicist perspective. And this endorsement happens historically. So basically, you need several hundreds of years or even millennia to pass for prophecy to be fulfilled. So you could see that the things that were predicted within the Old and the New Testament era were actually fulfilled. And this becomes yet an additional endorsement of the biblical writers that a modern prophet could never have, because a modern prophet, we cannot wait around 1,000 years to see if their predictions are fulfilled the way we did with the biblical prophets. So when we take all these elements together, there's a sort of mutual endorsement and mutual handshakes that happen between the biblical writers of the Old Testament, Jesus in the center, and the apostles after him, that they all reinforce each other. So it's not just the testimony of one individual here and there, but this collection of many individuals, 40 people, 40 different authors of scripture that basically support and reinforce each other into this collection with books we call the biblical canon. And because of this mutual endorsement, the scripture stands apart as a higher authority than pretty much anything else that we have. And any modern prophet, it's not a question of whether they're true or a false prophet. It's a fact that they cannot be part of this collective endorsement because the canon was closed 2,000 years ago. So they just can't fit in there as part of this group. So they stand apart. And the scripture then should and does become the sole basis of Christian theology, if you agree with the whole sola scriptura perspective. So because of this, the scripture, no matter what you think about modern prophets, the scripture stands alone and it's a separate thing, and all theology has to be based on scripture. Okay, so then what do we do with the idea of somebody like Ellen White? Well, within the Adventist Church, there's many people that have an epistemology where they mix scripture and Ellen White. So they kind of allow Ellen White to guide their interpretation of scripture. And that is the definition of a cultish epistemology based on this chart I've shown in the past, where I've pointed out that the prophetic-based epistemology doesn't work because you need the scripture to authenticate the prophet, but then you need the prophet to interpret scripture for you. So it becomes a circular argument. So there's a lot of people in the Adventist church that make this mistake and don't realize that you cannot have a scripture plus and a White epistemology. You automatically put yourself in the cultish category. And people that have grown up in the church or have been raised or educated to think this way need to deconstruct their theology and to reconstruct it based on this model that I'm presenting here, which is sola scriptura, which depends on those three components of limited errancy, biblical metaphysics, biblical macro narrative, and build their theology that way with the scripture alone. And that is, in fact, the methodology that I am presenting in this series of videos. So my methodology, the methodology that I'm sharing here, is Ellen White and denomination independent. In other words, somebody could listen to how I work through the methodology. They might say, hey, this makes sense. I understand that. I understand how it works. And they could go their way and do their own theology and never have to think about Adventism again. The methodology can be done by anybody. It doesn't have to be done by Adventists, and it doesn't need a denomination, and it doesn't need Ellen White for somebody to work through that theology. Okay, and that's what I'm focusing on here. So because of that, I am not really interested in tackling Ellen White questions. And I know a lot of critics of Adventism, they love to spend time debating Ellen White, and she said this and she did that. And that's an endless conversation because she's written hundreds of thousands of pages. And it is a complete waste of time for somebody like me to get involved in that, because I'm actually trying to present something here that matters. And I don't want to be distracted by trying to go over like 10,000 different supposed issues about she said this or did that. So I don't have a problem with Ellen White. I read her writings through my own lens, which is this particular theological model, the lens of the theological method that I'm presenting. It's the lens through which I read Ellen White. So because of that, I don't really have a problem with most of her stuff. And if there ever is something that I have an issue with or it doesn't really add up, I believe in limited errancy, which means I have no problem with saying she made a mistake or she was wrong here or whatever, because that doesn't conflict with my approach to theology. But be that as it may, I actually, when it comes to theology, I don't involve Ellen White at all, and I'm not interested in discussing her at all, because theology has nothing to do with Ellen White. It's based on the Bible alone. It should be based on the Bible alone. So if somebody has an issue with my methodology, we can discuss that. But Ellen White has no real, is completely irrelevant to what I'm trying to do here. So if somebody says, okay, I understand your methodology and I like what you're saying, whatever, and they're interested in studying Ellen White, then by all means, use the lens of this methodology to read through her writings, figure out for yourself what you think about her. I have no problem with that. I have no reason to recommend that somebody not read her or anything like that. Somebody's gonna say something like, well, if you were honest and you really knew all the stuff Ellen White says, and in fact I do, I've read pretty much everything she's written, and if you're really honest, you would tell the world that she's wrong and all this stuff. And I'm not going to do that because I don't believe that. Again, why? Because I read her writings through a particular lens that is this particular theological model. I don't believe in inerrancy, and again, most of the stuff I ever read by critics is nonsense anyway. Like they come up with all these objections, and when I go and dig up through the archives, the things are not really there that people are saying. And even if they're there, they don't really matter within the greater scope of things. Because if you think about it, if this is a legitimate approach to theology, and here's a person who claims to be a prophet who is endorsing this approach to theology, that's actually a point in their favor. Because, hey, somebody actually was supporting this particular view that other people haven't been able to figure out. But again, what I'm presenting is a methodology that's independent of, it doesn't rely on Ellen White in any way. So because of that, I'm not interested in having a discussion or a debate on Ellen White. I just pretty much ignore all those arguments. So if somebody sends me something against Adventism where there's all these accusations about Ellen White, I'm just going to ignore that whole section completely and address only those things that have to do with theology directly. All right, so that's more or less what I have to say on the topic. People are welcome to read her writings for themselves and figure out what they think. But if they're going to read them through a different theological model, they're automatically going to think she's wrong about pretty much everything. So there's no real point. If they think this is a legitimate model, what they should be asking is, do her writing make sense within this particular framework? So, yeah. Okay. And I believe, yeah, I have a couple of videos on some loose ends in Adventist theology, and then on Adventist history, and then some videos on philosophy, and then we'll start taking up other people's materials to dissect.